Matthew Deans is not a wrestler from the Midwest.
That's correct.
Nor is he Dr. Matthew C. Deans, who's another NASA researcher, who we have no plans to bring out here, from what I understand. But he does work on the Exploration Ground Data System, which, from what I can tell, and what I think is interesting as well, it has come into play most recently. I guess you're in Hawaii. This is a great scam. Instead of going to Mars, where it's really cold and hostile to life, you go to Hawaii, and they test out your software in Hawaii. Was Fiji close to you because it wasn't American, or have you considered the Maldives? The Maldives. Is Baffin Island an American territory? It's Devon Island. It's Canadian, right? So you can go to other countries. Mm-hmm. Have you thought of testing your stuff in Ibiza or
we gotta get you on a
the
proposal
Seychelles? I'm just saying I could red team that for you. This is hi. I'm Chris DeBona. I help look after the NASA Ames specific relationship between Google and that august institution. Join me in welcoming to our NASA speaker series, Dr. Matthew Deans. So Dr. Matthew Deans, not Matthew C. Deans. What's your middle name?
Charles. It is Matthew C. Deans.
That's really awkward.
There are two of them at NASA.
There's two Matthew C. Deans?
Yes. That's why we get each other's email.
Wow. Okay. Well, I don't think there's anything I can add, and we're really looking forward to learning from you today. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And thank you for that excellent introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about the Exploration Ground Data System, which is a research project that's been going on for several years now, and it's basically looking at how to build software tools to help future NASA missions get their work done. This is a picture of the moon. This is during the Apollo exploration of the moon. This is sort of the thing that NASA is best known for, is these sort of really impressive images of this trip to the. There's pretty good evidence that we've been to the moon. There are some debate about that, but I'm one of the people who's convinced by it. NASA is currently thinking about going back to the moon with robots, going deeper into space with human beings, and a lot has changed since the Apollo missions, and we're trying to figure out how to incorporate some of that new technology, some of that new thinking, some new approaches to how NASA does its exploration. So NASA has, of course, been many places since the Apollo era. Lots of satellites have gone and taken high-resolution data of the places that we want to go in the future. We have lots of cool tools like the moon in Google Earth that builds much better representations of what the moon looks like before we might go there. So we have a lot of opportunities to build up better maps than we had during the Apollo era to plan our exploration. And of course, we've been to the surface of Mars, and there are 3 rovers there now. And there's been a lot of technology developed on Earth that's developed for space, like the Dante walking robot and the Zoe rover and a bunch of these NASA systems that have been developed over the last several years. And these technologies are all designed with an intent of improving the way that NASA explores other planets. And of course, missing from this slide is a bunch of other stuff that's happening right here on Earth. Development of mobile technology and smartphones and Google Earth and all these great things that we can leverage to do NASA's work better. So we're trying to build these systems that basically help missions do all the things that they have to do before they go to the place that they're going to explore, while they're actually carrying out their mission, and then after the mission is over. And so we have these themes of planning, and planning really takes place from well before you actually go to the place that you're going, but it also happens while you're doing your work in that place. So you're replanning and you're thinking over again about how you're going to maximize your time there, wherever there is. Monitoring happens from the minute you hit the ground until the minute that you leave, and exploring your data and understanding your data begins the minute you start getting information back from this place, and it continues on into perpetuity. And so the challenge here is to really look at all these different phases of how you explore and building better tools. I'm not going to dwell on this architecture diagram because I want to build it up piece by piece, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how it all comes together or how it all came together. But this is the picture that I'm going to end up with at the end. And the way that we do that is that so NASA has these technology programs, and this technology program's purpose is to build these technologies. But there's not always a good driving use case for the building of the technology, and we often miss things like what do our users or what might our future users really need. Unless we can find a current day user, who can use the tools in the way that we're trying to design them, and then understand better what they're getting out of using them and what they need those tools to do, and then we iterate with them. And so we've gone off and we've found our own customers to do this work. I'm going to drill into each one of these pictures and talk about what these use cases are, what these science teams are trying to accomplish, and then how we're building the tools that help them do that. So I'll first talk about the K10 Rovers, and these are robots that we have built at NASA Ames and that we have taken to several different places around the world to explore the Arctic and to explore the desert in the southwest of the US. And these are small rovers. They're approximately the size of the MER rovers, maybe a little smaller. And the idea that we had with this experiment was to go off and do what we were calling robotic reconnaissance. And the idea is that if you want to send people back to the moon, then a really effective way to carry out that mission would be to first send robots and gather a bunch more information about what's there, and then use that information to plan a more effective human mission where you have a lot more information to make that plan with. And so we've done that mission out in the desert Southwest. We sent the robots out. We did a bunch of exploring of a lava flow in Arizona, and then we followed that up with a crew going out, and I'll talk about that in a moment, with a human crew going out in a crew vehicle and exploring the same place that the robot had been and using all that information they got from the robot. And we looked at what's the impact that we can bring. These are the K10 Rovers. We have two of them. One's K10 red, one is K10 black. They have a wide variety of instrumentation on board. They have cameras and inclinometers and compasses and a GPS unit and laser light stripers for obstacle avoidance. There's a gigapan at the top of the mast that's for taking wide angle, high resolution panoramas. A LiDAR scanner on top of the K10 red. That box is a high powered 3D laser scanner, builds very high resolution 3D terrain models of the environment. A ground penetrating radar. This box on the bottom of the K10 black is a Neutron Spectrometer, which works by firing high energy neutrons into the ground, and when they bounce off of hydrogen atoms and bounce back up to the detector, they're going a lot slower than they were when they were emitted by the neutron source, and you can detect this presence of hydrogen under the surface. So we carry this wide variety of scientific payloads, and we work with the science teams that understand what those instruments are and how they work and what they're telling them about the science. This picture on the left, K10 black again, has a dynamic cone penetrometer. It's drilling into the ground, and it's using information about how hard it is to drill into the ground to get a better understanding of what the surface properties are like the bearing strength of the soil. And then on the right-hand side, that's a microscopic imager which takes a few tens of microns per pixel images of the ground. And again, this is to get very high resolution information about what the soil types or what the rock types are on the surface for the geologists. So the test objectives here were for us, they were to test the rover technologies themselves. How well does the rover get around? How well does it avoid obstacles? How well does it get to where the places that we want it to go? We also wanted to understand things like what's the value of robotic reconnaissance for a human mission? What's the cost benefit look like for doing a human mission to the moon without robotic precursors or with robotic precursors? And then thirdly, for the science team, the goal here was to do geology. They were trying to do wide-scale geomorphology and understand the geology of the site. So the challenges to doing this are that we have a real-time science interaction with the robot. So unlike the Mars rovers, where you give it a set of things to do tonight, and then tomorrow it wakes up and it does them, and then at the end of the day it dumps back all the data that it collected for the day, and then your science team wakes up and they grab the data that came in and they think about it and they churn on it and they argue about it and they decide what to do tomorrow, and then they send another command up and the robot wakes up, and you sort of repeat this cycle. And if you are going to put a robot on the moon, you've got real-time interaction. You have 1 second of light propagation time delay, not 40 minutes. And you have continuous operations because it's always daylight on the moon for 2 weeks until the sun goes down and then it's dark for 2 weeks. So how do you facilitate that real-time science interaction, keep the scientists in the loop all the time and keep them aware of what's happening all the time? The second thing is real-time access to that mission data for the same reasons. They have to be incorporating the latest and greatest of every single piece of data that comes in, and it's used to evaluate what's happening, update their hypotheses, think about what the most effective thing is to do next. The third challenge for us was to design these systems for non-roboticists. I mean, I work in a research group of about 30 people who are all roboticists, and sometimes we build tools for ourselves and we forget that we're all expert users and that no one else can really understand how these things work. And so what we needed to keep in mind was that the robot is not the point. The robot is the means to an end. The robot is the way for the scientist to understand what's going on and to sort of facilitate their ability to remotely explore this place. And what that meant was we were also designing for novice users. And so when we do these terrestrial analog missions, we don't have a lot of time to train the scientists to use the interfaces. They show up, they work with us for a few weeks, and then they go back to their home institution, and we have to have tools that are easy for them to use so that they can come in and spin up quickly and then go off and use these things. So one of the first things that we realized was a challenge for a non-roboticist was how do we tell the robot where we want it to go and what we want it to do? And we hadn't really thought about this before because we always just sort of like drive the robot around in our test yard and we understand how to program scripts and stuff like that. So crickets, we had no idea actually how we were going to do this. The first idea we had was to walk around with a GPS unit and figure out where we were going and then download the coordinates and give them to the robot and say, now go do that. But that's kind of silly because then you have to actually go the place where you want the robot to go. It didn't really make sense. So the obvious thing was to draw a plan on a map and then figure out how to convert that into a thing that we can send off to the robot. So enter Google Earth, right? So this is like probably about 6 years ago or so. Google Earth was by then already available. It was an obvious thing for us to leverage and use. We didn't have to build the UI. We didn't have to develop the map content. We could just use this platform. That was a great thing for us to leverage. And so the way that this tool worked was that we would literally just draw a line. We would open up add a polygon tool, and we would draw on the map, and then we would save that out to a KML file, and then we would run this little script on it that would turn it into a thing that the robot could actually execute. So the robot now has coordinates and a coordinate frame that understands, and it's ready to go. The problem is that kind of plan only has two things in it. It has a bunch of coordinates and it has an order to visit them in, but it doesn't have any idea about what am I supposed to do when I get there, how long is this going to take, are there resources involved, none of that stuff. And so it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that this is a very limited way of thinking about planning. So what we wanted to do is build a better planner than that. So we thought about what actually needs to go into the representation of the plan, which is all these other things that was missing, the waypoints, ordering, objectives, timelines, tasks that need to be accomplished, the resources required to do that. And then separate from that, think about what is the right way to edit and view that thing. And it's not necessarily to do it in the same place where you're representing the thing. So when you're holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And there was one hook in the Google Earth that was introduced in Google Earth 4, which was the API for just a very small number of things that we could ask or tell Google Earth. And one of them was we could ask it, where's the center of the screen? And so the way that we built this system was that now, okay, on the left-hand side of this screen, you've got this Python tkinter UI panel, and inside this Python script is a full representation of all the things that you care about in the plan. And on the right-hand side, you've got Google Earth 4. And Google Earth 4's role in this design was just to show you a view of the plan on the map. So you ask Google Earth, please open this file. And in fact, that's not even an API call because you tell the Mac, open file, and then it knows to tell Google Earth, open that file. And then Google Earth goes and opens that link file. And that link file actually points to something else. It points to the actual plan KML file. And now we can, in our plan developing tool, we can write out this KML file to the disk, and then Google Earth will keep on polling the file system and getting new copies of it. And then inside of our planning tool, we can change what's in the plan and change the KML view of what's in that plan, and it just keeps on getting loaded into Google Earth. And then periodically, when we needed to, we would ask Google Earth, where's the center of the screen? And it would just come back with, here's the center of the screen. And this is the only API call that we needed in order to build this tool. So this is a tool that we started calling, for lack of a better imagination, we called it Geops, Google Earth for Ops. And the idea was that you would go move the map around until the crosshairs were in the place where you wanted the robot to do something, and then you would configure what you want the robot to do, and then click on the button on the left-hand side, and that would insert a task into the plan according to all the little configuration buttons and pull-down menus in the UI. And the trickiest bit of that was actually tasks that require an orientation, because if you want to take a picture of something, you can't just go to an XY location and take a picture. You have to take a picture looking in the right direction. And so we even had this little busy loop where one thread is writing to the file and the other thread is waiting for the user to to tell the UI that it's now pointed in the right direction. So we add this waypoint here, and it's asking to take a gigapan image, and then we move the map around and say, take a picture of this thing, and it reorients the waypoint to point at the thing we want to take a picture of. Okay, so this is a much more effective tool, much more powerful, much more useful. And here's an example of what one of these plans would look like for that mission that we did in the desert. So we've got a timeline view at the top. Now we know how long each task takes, what's the total duration of the entire plan, and this helps the science team understand, do I have time to get all this stuff done, or when will it be done? We've got the list view of stuff that the robot needs to do in the list at the bottom of that left-hand side. And we've got a map view that tells us where's it going to go and what's it going to look at when it gets there. So this is a big win. And I won't get into all the data displays and stuff like that we built for the K10 rover, because I'll have better stuff about that in just a moment. But here is where we wound up at the end of that experiment. So a couple things that we learned from that were that building all of these tools on open standards and open source available software was a great win for us, because it was a very small development effort and we got up and running very quickly. And second thing is that using Google Earth helped us greatly, because we don't have to write a lot of the code. We focus on writing the content. It's familiar to our users. Our science team users would show up and they're ready to use Google Earth because they've already used it. They use it at home. And the fact that it's all based on KML, which is an open standard and easy to write KML files, made it easy for us to integrate. And it made, in this little simple API of asking Google Earth, where's the center of the screen, helped us build this much more sophisticated tool than probably the people who built that API didn't ever think that somebody would use it in that way. So the next project I'll talk about is Desert Rats, and this is a mission that followed up the rover in the desert with a crew vehicle with simulated astronauts who would climb out of the back of the crew vehicle and go off and do EVAs on the ground, and they would carry sample bags and rock hammers, and they had a headset. They could talk in real time to the people in the back room. They actually climbed through the back of the suit, so that rather than going through an airlock, there's a hole in the back of their backpack, and they slide in, and then they shut the door behind them, and it seals against the back of the vehicle, and then they detach their suit from the truck, and they get out and they walk around. And the way that they operated this mission was that they had this idea of a tactical science operation team and a strategic science operation team. And the idea was that you had people who were awake and on console and working as the crew members were driving around and doing their EVAs, and they were their sort of, their reference back home to talk about the plan and make sure they were keeping on time and resources and all that kind of stuff. But then separately, and those people would burn out. In 8 hours, they were burned out, they were done. And then they would bring on this second science team, and that science team was like working a swing shift. They would get up and they would show up at the meeting, the handover meeting, and they would get a whole bunch of data, and they would be asked to sift through it all and figure out what happened in the last 8 hours while the crew was operating, and then come up with a new plan for tomorrow based on everything that happened. And so they were coming in cold, and they had a lot to figure out quickly. So we had lots of moving parts. We had lots of console operators, or 30 or 40 people all the time working on this thing. And we had this issue of the overnight strategic team understanding what happened and replanning everything in just a couple of hours. And they weren't even around for when the thing happened. So our job was, again, to help them build tools to help them do this work better. One of the first things that we built for them was a console log. And the way that this worked is that it would just pull up a little interface on the web, on a web browser, where they could actually, let me describe how they do it now. The way that NASA does this now in the Mission Operations Directorate at JSC, otherwise known as Mission Control, the way they often do this is they have Microsoft Word documents with macros, and they click a little macro button, and it pre-populates an area on the Word document, and they type in what they want, and when they're done, at the end of their console shift, they save that Word document to the file system, and it doesn't connect to anybody else's Word document, and there's Word documents all over the place, and no one can integrate them all, look at them all. They probably pull up those records when they need to, like if an archive, to go dig around and figure out what happened in the past, but they don't really have a streamlined, integrated thing. So, but we needed that because we needed the strategic team to have a quick sense of what happened, and they're not going to go read a bunch of Word documents in order to do that. So we built this console log that basically every person loads up, they point their web browser at the same location, and you authenticate as you, and it knows who you are, it knows what console you're sitting at, and when you create a note, it knows what time you created that note, and then you can type kind of whatever you want. And during this mission, we also had a naming convention for all the data that came back. So if it was an image or a video, then there's a naming convention for the data product, and if you pasted the data product name into your note, then it would automatically parse that out with like a regular expression and could tell that that's what that thing was, and then it would create a link automatically into the data archive, so you could have the note that you typed about a data product and the data product itself all integrated into the same place. So now anybody who's on that strategic science team can just show up, open up this console log, and they can just chronologically just read right through everything that happened, chronologically see it all in order, see all the images to help them understand what happened, and this helped them greatly get their work done. The second thing is that we built these map displays of all of the things that happened. So every place that the rover drove is tracked with these little cyan lines on the ground. We have a complete track of everywhere that it's been. Where the vehicle is now or where it was parked at the end of the day is in this, the icons there, the vehicle icons. Every data product that was captured during the day, we actually got two pieces of information. We got a piece of metadata first, and it would tell us what time was it taken, who took it, where was it taken, all those kinds of things. And then the second thing was the actual image or the actual video itself. And so if we got the metadata and we don't have the data product yet, we still know something is there. So we would put a place mark in the map, and we would make the icon for it red, which means it's not there. I mean, this is where it came from, but we don't have the data yet. And then the green ones are ones where this is where it came from, and we do have the content. So if you click on that place mark, you can pull it up and see the video, see the image, and it's ready to look at. And of course, the plan. So the plan for the day is the yellow line, and then the blue and the place marks and everything. That's actually what happened. One of the sort of tricky things about this was that there's this issue with Google Earth, which is if you dump a whole bunch of place marks in one place, which is what happens when a crew member hops out of this vehicle and they walk around. They don't get very far on foot. And they take a lot of samples, take a lot of images, take a lot of video. So what happens is if you try to look at this stuff, then you get this. These place marks kind of scatter as a pile of them. Now you click on one of them and you look at it, and then when you move your mouse focus away, then the pile collapses back onto itself, and you have no idea which ones are the things that you looked at and which ones are things you didn't look at. And so we had to come up with a little bit better way of organizing this information, which was to draw a bounding box around the entire EVA. So they would hop out of the vehicle and they would walk around and they would do what they do, and then we would know when do they start, when do they end, what's all the data we care about from that chunk of time, what's the bounding box that encapsulates all that information, and then build a much more complex description for the bounding box. And now if you click on the box, you can sort through all the things that happen chronologically rather than having to go try to find each one of those icons and click on it. And then another little plug here is that we, in addition to those two interfaces I just showed, which are using the Earth client, there was a separate project going on at NASA at the same time. It was the Google NASA Disaster Response Project, and they were building a tool called Share. And this is a couple of views of Share looking at wildfires and looking at responding to building collapse emergency. And we basically got to take this product that was built for another project and figure out how to plug it into our architecture so that we could use it for science purposes as well. This is an image of Share used for disaster response in Haiti. And so we got to just plug this into our architecture, and now it's being used by a science team to do field geology instead of by disaster response crews to be doing disaster response. And so at the end of that mission, we have now more tools plugged into our architecture. Now we have planning tools, tracking tools, data organization and search tools, map generating tools, all this stuff. So as a result, we built these tools that did actually help people understand very quickly what happened. We moved away from having all the data be generated by scripts and dumped onto a file system, and we moved to a Django, MySQL-backed sort of approach so that everything can be generated dynamically, and it was a lot cleaner and a lot easier for us to organize the data and keep it straight. And having that strategic science team was a really powerful driver for us because we thought we had a pretty good idea of how to build things that would help people get this kind of thing done, but we didn't really know what we didn't know until we tried to actually do that. Okay. The next project I'll talk about is the Pavilion Lake Research Project. And this is a team of people who are exploring lakes in Canada. And if this submarine looks familiar to you, if you've ever seen the 80s movie The Abyss, the company that built these submarines is the same company that built some of the hardware that was used to film that movie. Both the hardware in the movie as well as the hardware that was used to actually shoot the film. And this is Darlene Lim. She's the PI, she's the PI of the project. She is a limnologist, and what they're doing is studying the bottom of this lake. There are these things that are called microbialites. I'll show them in just one second. And there are these rocks that form. Actually, why don't I just go ahead and show you? There are these rocks that form over time, and they believe that they're formed in the presence of biology, that there is sediment being trapped by microbial mats, and that the conditions in the water, the physical conditions, the chemical conditions, sedimentation rates, temperatures, light, all these things affect what types of microorganisms grow, and then the types of microorganisms affect what shapes of rocks form as a result. And so their working hypothesis is if we can figure out what conditions in the lake cause these things to make certain shapes of rocks, then we can look around and find the rocks and then reverse engineer what were the conditions that existed in this place when this rock was formed. And some of them might have been formed very, very long ago, and they can do things like carbon date them to figure out when did this form and then sort of recreate the history of the lake. So they're looking at microbialite formation, and they're looking at lake geology and biology. And one of the cool things about working with them is this is actually a science-driven project. So the K10 Rovers and the Desert Rats, these are things where we were creating a science objective for ourselves and then going through the motion of science operations. It wasn't actually a brand new scientific investigation. People had been to this lava flow in Arizona before, and they already knew about it. This is something that no one really understands yet, and this science team is trying to really get brand new work done. They're a very distributed science team. There's lots of people from universities in Canada, the US, NASA centers, company partners. They're all over the place. They plan this thing far in advance. They don't just come together for a quick field test season and start their planning. They plan for months before they get out there. They actually analyze their data afterward. They care about the scientific data that they're collecting in the lake. Their short trip to the lake is about getting the data that they need in order to do their work. Their work is to analyze that data over months and write scientific publications and get journals out and that kind of stuff. And it's a multi-year campaign. They've been doing this for years, and they need to use data that they collected last year to plan for this year. So this is our old friend Geops, and it turned out for lots of reasons that this was not sufficient for what they needed to do. So I talked before about all the things that Geops got us to add to our planning tool, but it didn't have a rich interaction, didn't have a fast interaction. It wasn't platform independent. You had to run it on a Mac. It was a thick client. You had to install software on your Mac in order to run it. So we wanted to make it easier for them anybody can use this thing. It's a server somewhere else. You all point your web browsers to it, and you can make plans. And the last thing that it didn't have, which ended up being really can be a nightmare, is version control. So if I make a plan and then I copy it to a server, and then somebody else makes a plan, and which version do I need, and do we have all have the same version, all this kind of stuff. So this is much more of like a Google Docs kind of analogy. We put the plan in a place where anyone can get it. They all have edit access, and then if anybody updates it, then you don't have to wonder about whether or not you have the latest version. So we built a web-based planner. And this is what it looks like. It uses the Earth plugin, again, rather than the desktop Earth client. And it has a lot of the same things that Geops has. It's just rearranged and built in a web-based form. So there's a map on the left-hand side. You can draw where you want to go. You can get estimates of the timeline that will take by giving it an average vehicle speed, for example. And you can enter a bunch of other information about the plan, like who is planning it, what's the purpose of this plan, give it a name if you'd like, and then rename the waypoints. And there's this set of this box in the bottom right-hand side here is a list of the waypoints and the order in which they're going to happen, and any naming or notes about why you're doing this thing. Or you can put a note in about the leg between waypoint 2 and waypoint 3. You can say, hey, while you're going from here to there, watch out for this stuff. And so they can build these really complex plans and save them onto the server, and they all have a much better place to share them. And then on top of that, it became much more obvious that they need information in order to plan. They don't just need the map that's the base layer in Google Earth. They need context. They need to know, what do we know about this place? What information do we have? Why are we going there? What are we trying to look at? And also constraints. Where can we not go? And where do we need to start and end each submarine mission? So we built them this map server. And this is a really dead simple concept. The idea is that if they need to get access to a bunch of different maps, then again, it's a version control and sharing issue. We don't want to be emailing everybody copies of maps, and then anytime the map changes, I have to worry about, do I have the right version of it? We just built them basically a content management system where we put all the maps into a centralized server. Everyone points their Earth client, or if you load the web-based planner, it already points there. points to this centralized server, all the map layers are available to everyone, and they're always current, and they're always the latest and greatest and the right one. And the nice thing about it, of course, again, is that it's KML. So anything that can be turned into KML can be turned into a map in our map server. And so here's just a couple of examples. This is the Bedrock geology around Pavilion Lake. And this is important because they're looking at things like what are the groundwater inputs and what's the mineralogy, what's the chemistry of that groundwater. And so if you know what kind of rocks the groundwater flowed through, you know something about what's being introduced into the lake. Here is another one. This is a sonar map of the lake that was generated by an unmanned submersible that flew transect surveys in the lake and collected sonar data. And they have two things that come out. One is the bathymetry of the lake, the depth of the lake, rendered into color, where blue is deep and red is shallow. And separately, a backscatter map that looks at the surface roughness of the bottom of the lake. And they can look for little interesting nooks and crannies that way, rather than just looking at the absolute depth from here to the bottom. And they can also, and again, it's KML, you can embed anything you want. It doesn't have to be a ground overlay. It can be place marks with embedded description tags and links to other information. And so this is, again, this is Sonar backscatter data, but now rather than producing one map of the entire thing, we have little preview images of here is an interesting thing somebody found when they looked through the data, and we can cross-reference it to where was it when the submarine, where was the submarine when it took that data, where is that point in the lake, and then drop all these points of interest into the map. And now a planner can go in and say, okay, well, look through all these previews and say, these are the kinds of things I want this plan to go visit, and then build a submarine plan to go visit the places that are the points of interest that they want to go visit. And so the map server was very helpful. And then the third thing we did for them was to make some small modifications to how the data archiving worked. So the submarines for Pavilion Lake have a video camera on board, and they videotape everything all the time. And then when the pilot's flying around, they don't really have much in the way of interfaces or controls or computing. They're in a submarine that's like the size of a business class airplane seat, wrapped in glass and I don't even know what, steel, rubber. And they don't have much room in there besides the space that they need for 2 hands and 2 feet to control the submarine, and then they have a voice-activated microphone headset to talk up and down. So if they see something cool, generally what they do is they just tell somebody on topside, hey, this is really cool, write this down. I'm looking at a tree with a microbialite on it, which is cool because they can go sample the tree and carbon date the wood, and it helps them figure out when the rock was formed. So what we did was we built a system to post-process the data that came back and cross-reference those moments where the pilot said something like, this is really cool, come back to this, and cross-reference that with the video that was rolling at the same time, just matching up timestamps. And so, again, building up a chronological list of what happened by merging that data afterward. And this looks like the Desert Rats console log, essentially, and it's more or less the same type of thing. So at the end of that, we had an architecture that looked something like this. We had the vehicle tracking and the logs and the data maps that we're building in real time. But we added this map server, and we added the web-based planner for the distributed science team to use. And our search tools got a lot better because we're working with a science team that's using the search tools for months and years. So some lessons that came out of that, this web-based planning platform was much more effective for the team. The data archives are something that the scientists use throughout the year. It helps them tremendously with getting their, doing their scientific analysis. And the cool thing about them too is that they did this work before they worked with us, and then they did this work with us, helping them out and building these tools and helping them use them. And we still don't have a satisfactory methodology for quantifying the impact that these tools have, but they make no bones about the fact that it is absolutely night and day. They used to argue over where they were when they saw this thing. Okay, so the last one I'll talk about is Resolve. And Resolve is a mission concept for sending a rover to the South Pole of the Moon and looking for water ice. So we know LCROSS, NASA a couple years ago, sent this impactor to the South Pole of the Moon, and the plan was to impact the Moon with the upper stage of a Centaur rocket and then watch the plume and see if you can detect water in the plume. And they could. They detected water at the South Pole of the Moon, but now they don't know where is it, what form is it in, how hard is it to get to, what's the distribution. They only know that there's one place where this rocket crashed and there was water in that one place. And so this mission concept is, how do we go and map out the South Pole of the Moon with a robot that has a neutron spectrometer on it, and to look for hydrogen, as I described before, a near-infrared spectrometer to look for water absorption bands and this kind of stuff. And we did a field test in Hawaii last summer, in July of last summer, where we simulated a mission to the South Pole of the Moon with this robot. Okay, so we're searching for polar volatiles. We're in a sort of a prospecting mode, and we're testing out the Resolve instruments. These are instruments that are designed specifically for this purpose, and we're going through the motions of using them in a way that we intend to use them to see how well it works for us. And so I started to describe, we have a near IR spectrometer, a neutron spectrometer, and then there's some analysis tools. The rover has a drill and a couple sample processing instruments to actually get really high resolution, really quantitative information about what exactly it drilled up. And it's all carried by a rover. And the challenges here are that we had a distributed team, and they're working in real time. The same argument for the K10 experiment I talked about before. We're going to the South Pole of the Moon. We have real-time communications. The science team needs to make quick decisions. And on top of that, the concept here is a very short duration mission, like a few days. The South Pole of the Moon is a very hostile place. If this mission is not going to be a super expensive, sophisticated, nuclear-powered thing that can keep warm at night and all those kinds of things, then it needs to be get in, get the job done, and when the sun goes down, that's it. So they have to get a lot done in a very short span of time. In fact, the MER rovers didn't even get off the lander before this mission would be over. So the job of the science team is to quickly determine where's the water and what to do about it, sampling it. They need to map the area, find the water signature, decide where to drill, and then go back and drill in the right spot. And our job, again, was to help build tools to help them do this. So one of the first things that we built for them was a plotting tool, and we sort of borrowed the Slippy map idea to make Slippy plots. And the idea here was that we pre-compute and cache tiles of data. And when I say tiles, I'll describe in a second why that's in quotes. But the idea was to have a tool for them that they could quickly zoom in and out of the plot and slide the plots around and have different variables plotted on different plots that are synchronized all the time. So you can correlate instrument data across multiple instruments very easily. The tiling scheme, and again, this is really just about efficiency. So if you have a whole bunch of people all trying to load these plots all at the same time, and every transaction with the server is really cumbersome, then it's not going to scale well. Thought those were turned off. And so the idea here was that for every window of time, we would compute an average rather than passing you all the data from every time window. Compute an average and compute standard deviation, min and max kind of stuff to summarize the data in a time window, and then subsample the time windows down. And the idea would be then that you can, if you zoom out on the map, then you'd have data where each plot is at the same resolution in terms of the screen resolution, but the time resolution is changing. You're zooming out, you're shrinking timescales, but you're only packing as much data into each time slice at that scale as every other, and that keeps things efficient. And then that data was served to the client over a WebSocket. So you would open up the plot, and the plot would say, okay, here's some JavaScript. The JavaScript would say, okay, I need these tiles, what I'm looking at right now. And then as you interact with the plot and change what you're looking at and zoom in and out or pan left and right, it just knows to go fetch the right tiles that it needs for that. So this is what that looked like. There's a plot here of a couple of the payload instruments. There's a drill. The orange line is the actual force of the drill bit. The blue line is the depth of the drill bit. And the green at the top is the neutron spectrometer looking for hydrogen under the surface. And the black line at the very bottom is the near-infrared spectrometer and is looking for water absorption bands in the infrared spectrum. And so when you get into it and start drilling, there's a point where the force on bit sensor has a little blip, and that's when you know that the drill touched the ground. There's a force detected. And so every bit that the blue line goes above that horizontal reference line, that's the actual depth of the drill bit going into the ground. And then you can see that as the drill starts to enter the ground, that water signal on the bottom plot starts to rise. And what that means is that the drill is drilling into the ground, is pulling up dirt from the subsurface, and that subsurface dirt is wet. As the drill gets deeper and deeper, that water signature goes away. So that means that there's really only a layer of water. The stuff below that that's coming up is dry again. And then when the drill bit came out of the ground, on the right-hand side, the blue line crosses that red horizontal line, and the water signal goes up. Well, that was curious. So because these are all cross-referenced with time, we could go get the images And it turns out that when the drill string came out of the ground, the borehole collapsed. It was like loose soil. So when the borehole collapsed, that exposed some more wet material. And so the near IR spectrometer is seeing that wet material. The second thing we built for them was Raster Maps. And the idea was that the rover is telling us where it is, and the Neutron Spectrometer is telling us whether or not it's seeing water. But there was no place where these two pieces of information were being reconciled. So we built a map generating server that would dynamically create a grid map of the Neutron Spectrometer data based on the rover location. And so this is a pretty straightforward thing. We get two pieces of information. We stick the hydrogen signature into the map at the location where the rover says that it is. And then the cool thing about it was we could build a real-time dynamic super overlay. So now we can build a tree of tiles and point your Earth client at this, and you could load in a super overlay that was changing in real time as the spectrometer was mapping the environment. And so when you put it all together, it looks like this. Here's the rover, where it's been. The purple line is the plan. We've stopped following the plan because we've seen something interesting, and now we drive around in circles. I shouldn't say circles, spirals. We're driving around in a mapping pattern, and we're filling in more and more information around the site. And so now this is really helpful because now the plot at the top is showing you what was the neutron spectrometer value versus time. But that doesn't tell you how to get back there. The map, you can see exactly where that orange bright spot is, and that's where you want to go send your rover back and drill for that water signature. And then once that framework is in place, of course, we can put anything else in there. So this is the neutron spectrometer map, but we can take other instruments like the near-infrared spectrometer and map the data that's coming out of that as well. And so this is just a different view of a different signal that might indicate the presence of water. Okay, so for Resolve, we got these great tools for real-time display, and the real upshot of this was that the science team was convinced these were people who actually worked on LCROSS, and so their experience of working on a mission that only lasted for a few hours, and that they were not yet convinced that it was possible to do this kind of real-time science with a rover on the south pole of the moon. And I think that we convinced them that these types of tools with geospatial visualization and this quick dynamic mapping, that it actually was possible for them to do this science in real time. And so at the end of that experiment, we had an architecture diagram that looked more like this. Now we've got all the best tools from all the different projects that we've supported, and it all comes together to make this big picture. So in conclusion, xGDS is a lot of things. It's map content management, a planning tool, real-time monitoring, plots, maps, notes in real time, post-processing, data archives, and it's all these tools for browsing and searching the data afterward. It's been really helpful to use Google tools, Google products in order to do that, using cool Google Earth and Earth plugin platforms. It facilitates integration. We can get map content from anybody and just plug it in. It reduces our development. We don't have to worry about writing a map UI. We just use the one that already exists, and we can focus on the content. It reduces training because we have people who come to work with us and they're already familiar with how these tools work. And it really helps to support doing real-time distributed collaboration because it's all web-based and it's easy to just get everybody to coordinate and work online. And collaborating with scientists has been really powerful for us because it drives innovations that we otherwise wouldn't know what we don't know until we work with them. And it helps them do their work, and it's difficult to quantify how well it helps them do their work, but it's they're convincing about the fact that it's a huge benefit to them. So some future directions right now, the couple things we're working on right now is that planner tool I showed earlier doesn't really know much about what types of things you might want to get done. And we're working on a extensible command dictionary framework so you can write your own file that describes all the different types of tasks you might want to do, how long each one might take, what resources it might need, and then the planner can dynamically generate all the user interfaces based on that schema, and then if you generate a plan from that, then it saves it all out in a format that encapsulates all that task information. We're working on telemetry handling. We have a lot of systems that send telemetry at a very high rate for a long period of time, and so we're having to scale up in terms of how we deal with all that data. We also want to be able to play it back afterwards. So right now we capture a lot of data, we make it visible, but we can't play it back as though it's happening in real time, and we're looking at that too because that will help payload designers and people who are working on these tools that are downstream from those systems be able to work with canned data that's being sent back out in the same way that it would be from the live payload. We're working on an analyst notebook, which is based on IPython notebook. If you're familiar with that, it's basically a way to do MATLAB or Mathematica style analysis with a command line interface. and we're integrating that with our website and making it available to scientists to use. And we're looking at trying to do an open source release with this. We want to try to develop a more generic set of I/O standards, so it's easier for people to just take our system and use it. If it's based on easy formats to get in and out of the system, it'd be easier for people to go ahead and use. And on deploying that out to the cloud. And if any of that sounds exciting to you and you want to help, come talk to us. Yeah.
Why Google Earth and not NASA Whirlwind?
Ooh, zinger first.
Let's start right off there.
And Matt, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was why Google Earth and not NASA Whirlwind? When we started this project, NASA Whirlwind was still a relatively young project. And I started using Google Earth on this because I actually was more familiar with it sooner. I'm actually not even sure where NASA Whirlwind is now. But NASA's a big place. Lots of people working on lots of different things. And from where we were and the things that we were looking at, when we made a decision about how to do this, Google Earth just was the most obvious choice for us to use.
No, I have a couple questions. So my first question is sort of a non-technical question. You were talking about the requirements for field study software. And one of the ones that you listed was usable to novice users. Because in the field campaign world, you're dealing with Earth, scientists here on Earth who are not familiar with your tools. And that seems obviously useful if your goal is to support Earth scientists on Earth. It seems less obvious that that's a good parallel to actual NASA mission ops. If you look at rover ops, those are not novices driving or doing science. To what degree do you think that the fact that you're focusing on Earth scientists doing earthly problems who are not full-time NASA engineers colors the tools you're building? What would you be doing differently if you were doing this actually for a NASA mission and not for an Earth field campaign?
Right, yeah. Okay, so I'll try to summarize that question. The question was, does our focus on novice users and our focus on easy-to-use interfaces, does that color our research? Because if we were doing this for a NASA mission, we would have time to train them, and we would have more time with them, and they might require more sophistication than you can put into an interface for a novice user. And in fact, the planning tools that they use for the Mars rovers now are quite sophisticated, and they have experts who use them. So I think that those are all very good points. I think that the first thing I would say is that it is an artifact of how we do our work that we have to focus on interfaces for novice users. But this is a thing that comes up all the time in the world of looking at terrestrial analogs for space. No analog is actually a good analog for the thing that you're trying to do. So that's one way in which we know that the thing that we're trying to do it's not a one-to-one match with what they're trying to do. But the other thing is that the science team on the Mars rovers are not expert users of the rover planning software. So their job is to come up with, what do you want the robot to go do next? And they come up with a much higher level sort of intent, expression of intent. And then it's somebody else's job, it's the sequence generators and the roboticists at JPL who say, okay, how do we get the rover to carry out the science team's intent? And those are the expert users who use those more sophisticated planning tools. And I think there's room for both of those things.
My other question is shorter. So you use some Google tools. What could Google be doing that would make your job easier? How could we help from Google's perspective as opposed to from joining your team, which would be fun but different?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. I wish that I had a running log of all the feature requests, bug fixes, nifty ideas that we've had over the last couple of years. And I think that maybe one benefit from my coming here today would be to have a better line of communication back to folks here. Not, like you said, having to join our team, but even just having better connections to folks here who work on some of these things, where we could actually say, hey, we're using this tool and it almost does what we need, but not quite. That would be a really helpful thing. Yes?
I perceived that most of the focus was on planning back at the home base. Are you also you might have already answered this and I just spaced out and missed it, but are you also working on connected work that the people running the missions would use the tools live? That make sense?
Yes. So the question was, a lot of this seems to focus on planning, and are we working on things that are more about the live operations of a mission? Yeah. So I think that that some of the tools I talked about I probably spend a lot less time focusing on them, but we do have tools that are designed to build a real-time operating picture of what's going on and try to keep the scientists in the loop and situationally aware of what's happening on the ground. I mean, that's a very critical use case for these tools.
Do you have any interesting process for working on the usability of the tools that people work in the field, which are potentially more specialized?
Yes, the question was, do we have any usability tools for what we're doing? We actually don't have any usability experts on our team, and I think that would be a really useful thing to have. We are probably guilty of committing the same sin that lots of developers commit, which is that we think about usability as an afterthought. And there are a few people in our division, a few people who work on projects in our building who do have that experience and can bring that experience to those projects. We tend to take a much less formalized approach, and we have people who sort of commit their novice interest and intent to building better user interfaces by just talking to the science team about what's working, what's not, what's confusing, what isn't, watching them work and watching them struggle and seeing where their pain points are, even if they can't point them out themselves, and going off and fixing them. But we don't use any kind of formal UI development approaches.
Well, I mean, just talking to users is not a bad.
Oh yeah, no, that's a good, yeah, sure, it's a good starting point, absolutely.
So you talked about cloud deployment and all the sort of server infrastructure you have. How do you weigh the balances between stuff that has to work without connectivity versus the stuff that you want to be connected? And where's especially in future development, where's that line fall? Yeah,
that's a great question. So the question was about deploying to the cloud or using network-heavy stuff versus stuff where connectivity might not even be available. I didn't talk about it again in this talk, but we do have some work where we're looking at things like how to put a lot more smarts onto a mobile device, maybe even one that gets synced up with your services and downloads a bunch of data, maybe like your plan and that kind of stuff. And then you go off and you use your mobile device to capture data. You can record stuff on it, videos, images, notes, whatever. It tracks where you're going all the time, and then syncing that back up again later when you're back online. And we've looked at that for the disaster response project in particular. And we've been thinking about ways to use that for field geology as well. I mean, some of these places that we go, we have connectivity because we go and we bring a whole bunch of networking equipment and Tropos units and we set it all up, and we have connectivity because we make connectivity. But we have our own little pocket of high-powered network connectivity in the middle of nowhere. And so yeah, I think that we are mostly focused on simulating places where, or simulating situations where we have a rover on the surface of another planet and we have the deep space network and we have the infrastructure to talk to it. Maybe not the same as you would if you have your Ethernet cable in your office, but some connectivity back to the rover, at least when the DSN dishes are pointed at it. But yeah, that's a very interesting use case for us as well. Yep.
How much of this can be used for outreach? So if you have novice users that are scientists and they're able to do mission planning and they collect all their data in the system, why transfer it somewhere else? Is there much of an interface for sending school kids to look at this data?
Right, yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and one of the cool things about building these tools the way that we do is that it's very easy to just take stuff that we have in our system and turn it into an EPO product, into an outreach product. It's already pretty much canned and ready to go for that. The tricky thing, interestingly enough, ends up being about stuff like proprietary data that the science team needs to do their work and not get scooped by scientists who aren't working on the project. But we have actually done that kind of work as well. We've had a lot of interaction with outreach programs. A lot of these projects have their own outreach programs, and they ask for bits and pieces. They kind of pull examples out and use them as outreach products. But yeah, it's actually a pretty easy thing to facilitate because it's already in the right format. All right, thank you.